Today is the 48th in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history, and there should be about an hour and a half or so of questions. If we get more questions, we can definitely continue with those. And accordingly, that's where we'll start. Any questions, comments, concerns? There's a question of what is the genesis of militant Islam? The issue with the question is that there is Islamic-inspired violence, but there's not a through line of that violence. So there are different kinds of Islamic violence in different periods of time. If we're talking about the kind of violence that we're seeing today, in terms of terrorism and the like, the through line is as follows. You have this shattering in the early 20th century, and we're at this point more or less in our discussion, where the old system, the Ottoman Empire system, has broken down. And so the question is, how do you create a Muslim state? And by Muslim state, I mean a state for people who happen to be Muslim, right? How do you create a Muslim state in the modern era? Because now we're outside of the medieval period, we're in the modern period, right? And the functional difference between a modern and medieval state is that a modern state is a unitary state, in the sense that the government controls every aspect of the state. It's not based on a feudal relationship between the government and a number of nobles, and they have agreements between each other, and then those nobles have a degree of autonomy, and they can manage their local issues as they like. In fact, we showed throughout the Ottoman Empire that most of the Arab world was subject to these autonomous rulers, more so than the Sultan Caliph of Istanbul. And so as we shift to this modern state, there becomes a question of how do you structure that apparatus? And there were a bunch of different answers to that question. You have answers like we saw from Ataturk today, of trying to create a nationalist consensus. You build sort of an ethnic unity. In the case of the war so far, the nationalist army, that coalition is around Muslim ethnic identity, right? There's using that religious term as an ethnic term. Are you ethnically Muslim or are you ethnically not Muslim? If you're ethnically Muslim, this is your state. And that sort of brings people together and sort of creates a foundational idea of leadership and sort of what's valid and invalid from a cultural perspective. That's one way you could do it. Another way you could do it was through liberalism, right? You could embrace the Western model of open democracy, plurocentrism, for a number of different reasons, primarily because it looked like exactly the imperialists that they were fighting in many cases. It was rejected. And there really is no liberal state that develops in the Muslim milieu. To a certain degree, we can argue about whether Israel or Tunisia has become one of those kinds of liberal states, but by and large, this solution is rejected. The other solution that comes to the fore more in the 50s and 60s is Arab socialism or Arab nationalism, because Arab nationalism has a lot of these socialist elements, and it tries to find a third way between Western liberalism and somehow Soviet communism. Communism was never popular in the Arab world for a variety of reasons. It just didn't seem like a model that would fit. And also none of the Arab states were industrialized enough to have a proletariat. So it just didn't seem like a good fit for the Middle East from the perspective of most Middle Easterners. But socialism, something more Soviet than typical Western governments, that was seen as desirable, and nationalist elements were mixed in with that socialism. But all of these required the authority of the Ottoman Empire to be vested in a secular or mostly secular ruler. And there was huge resistance to that from the religious part of the population, the conservative part of the population. And so they struck out to create a religious answer to modernity. How can we create a religious modern state? And that religious modern state was encapsulated by the writings of Hassan al-Banna, who founded the Muslim Brotherhood, Alam al-Duli, who founded the Jamiat Islami in Pakistan and in India, and by Sayyid al-Qutb, who is responsible for the formulation of modern Islamism. And right, this is the belief that you should have an Islamic theocracy, and that will be the way you govern your modern state. And for a number of reasons in the 60s and 80s, the 60s to the 80s, the secular states in the Middle East failed. And they failed to resist the imperialists. They failed to resist the Zionists. They failed to improve the economic situation at a domestic level. They failed to deal with corruption. They failed to deal with price increases on basic goods. They, by and large, they failed, and they failed tremendously. And the only group that never gave any validity to the secular enterprise was not the nationalists, not the socialists, not the liberals. Even the liberals believed in the Arab socialists to a certain degree, but the Islamists had rejected them at every single turn, had rejected the validity of their secular government at every single turn. And so by the mid-1980s, you begin to have a lot of support within the Arab world for something different, right? It's a lot of the same sort of support that we see, for example, in the United States, previous to Trump, of we need somebody to shake things up, which is why if you look at voters in 2015, right, a lot of them would say, I'll vote for Sanders or I'll vote for Trump, despite the people having two completely different policies, because it's something different and we need something different. And so Islamism became intensely popular as a way of moving the Arab world forward. Part of that movement was that violence against the West was permissible, and violence against westernized institutions was permissible. And the way that you would do this was through an instantiation of jihad, which was called jihadism, that the actual act of violence in promotion of the theocratic government is itself sanctified. And we can see parallels to this in the Communist Manifesto, supporting the idea that you need a violent revolution of the pre-existing capitalist state in order to create a new communist utopia. In the same way, you need an overthrow of the Western-aligned secularist government, regardless of whether they're actually truly Western-aligned from a diplomatic perspective, of this Western-based secular government for an Islamic government. You need an Islamic revolution. And that's where a lot of the violence comes from, is this instantiation from people who support Islamism as a future vision. Now, Islamism isn't still not extremely popular. When in countries where you can vote on Islamist politicians, they usually receive between 15 and 25% of the vote. But as we can tell from the United States, when it comes to the evangelicals, who roughly constitute the same size in population, they can have a seriously disproportionate impact. And so that's where you're seeing a lot of Islamist violence. In terms of other forms of terrorism, like the PLO, which is at least nominally secular, like some of the Muslim militants in other places, their motivation isn't Islam usually, or their motivation is usually politics. And it comes out of whatever political struggle they're resisting. In the case of the PLO, the resistance is toward Israel as a nation state, or Zionism more generally. In cases like Pakistan, we see it with regards to India and the existence of India. That's where you're seeing a lot of this sort of violence that's not religiously oriented, even though the people who practice it happen to be Muslims. That's why, for example, the PLO has had Christian leaders in the past, because it's not a religious struggle primarily for them. For other groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, it absolutely is a religious struggle because they are Islamist organizations. I hope that sort of answered the question, Beverly. There's a question. It seems as though Western Anatolian, Cappadocian, and Pontic Greeks were doomed. Even the Greeks in Istanbul were ethnically cleansed during the 1950s. The Turks were going to get rid of them no matter what. Thoughts? I think that if we take the Turks from, let's say, 1890 forward, I think that we're sort of locked in this sort of direction of the CUP's ascension, and with the CUP's ascension, the idea that Turkish nationalism is the direction of the Ottoman Empire. I don't think, however, that if we rewind to before the 1890s, that was necessarily going to be the outcome. If you had an Ottoman Sultan who was really interested in the process of Ottomanism, as opposed to Abdul Hamid, who was absolutely not interested in that process, but if you had one who was absolutely interested in the process, and he spent the effort to create schools that would promote cultural interaction, that would increase the prominence of the Ottoman Senate, which was already religiously diverse, ethnically diverse, you could have created something similar to the Ottoman United States. I don't know how effective it would be in the long term. I don't know if it would be effective at resisting all the Balkan wars that would be fought against it. But what I do think is that it's not necessarily the case that we were locked from, the moment that nationalism shows up on the scene in the early 19th century, to mono-ethnic states in the Balkans and mono-ethnic states, and Turkey being a mono-ethnic state. I don't think that that's the case, and I don't think Turkey's a mono-ethnic state anyway right now. It just happens to be a Muslim monolith. But within the Muslim community, there are Alevi, there are Kurds, there are Laws, there are Circassians, there are Muhajir. There's a lot of ethnic diversity within Turkey, and I think one of the great developments that is starting to happen in Turkey, and it will take a while, it'll take decades, but one of the great developments that I'm starting to see in Turkey is really a questioning of what does it mean to be a Turk from a citizen perspective? What does it mean to be a Turk from an ethnic perspective? And is it possible for Turkey to be a strong state, a viable state, while embracing the multiplicity of identities that Turkey even currently holds? We'll see how that goes, but I don't think that it's necessarily the case that they were doomed from the point of nationalism. I think they were doomed from the point where Abdulhamid decided that rather than try to deal with the demands that the Armenians and the Greeks were making, to massacre them, and that would be the solution. There's a question of whether the PKK is socialist or communist, and how did it come to be? And there's a second of, did Ataturk and Hitler ever meet? The second one is easier to answer. I'm not aware of any meeting between the two of them. I don't think that they would see eye to eye. Ataturk, we have to remember who Ataturk was in terms of his CUP allegiance. While the CUP certainly organized the Armenian and Greek genocides, and Ataturk certainly permitted his commanders to use violence against Greek civilians and Armenian civilians, as we saw during the war, the extent to which he had full control over them is not entirely clear. And Ataturk himself never endorsed the genocides, as far as I can tell. At best, he said neutral things about them. There are comments where he reportedly lambasted the genocide, but those comments are of a dubious nature. Ataturk himself was not terribly enamored with the idea of ethnic pluralism, but at the same time, he wasn't the kind of person to sort of pull the trigger and say, what we need to do is eliminate them all. I think from the perspective of trying to make Turkey a mono-ethnic state in the Treaty of Lausanne, he was seeking a way to prevent future violence, because a lot of the previous Balkan wars had been started from Greeks, Serbs, and Bulgarians saying that there were Greeks, Serbs, and Bulgarians within Ottoman territory and we have to liberate them. Okay, if we get rid of all of the Greeks and we get rid of all the Christians, now they can't make the excuse. And by and large, the Greco-Turkish border has held. There are places where it hasn't, like Cyprus. There are places where the Greco-Turkish situation is worse than it should be, such as Turkish air flights into Greek space and Greek airspace, other sorts of issues like that. But by and large, Turkey and Greece have a functional relationship. And I think that the population exchange, while brutal and contrary to most human rights norms we have today, effectively allowed for that 100-year peace that we have now to happen. In fact, Greeks and Turks both fought in the Korean War on the Allied side. The Turks actually served in a number of very difficult battles where they received honor and distinction. But the Greeks and the Turks, as far as I'm aware, never served together. But it's very strange to see the Greeks and the Turks serving together less than 17 years after they had literally been at war with each other over their sovereign territory. So given that, and Ataturk's general desire to stay outside of European politics, keep Turkey neutral while he industrialized. I don't think he would have reached out to Hitler. He died in 1938. So there was certainly overlap in their administrations. But as far as I'm aware, I don't believe that they met. That said, İsmet İnönü, who was his successor, did have meetings with high-level German diplomats concerning his lack of entry into World War II. The Germans tried to bring the Turks into World War II. The Turks remained adamantly neutral, and may even have had a pro-Allied stance. It's debatable where Turkey was during World War II, but regardless, Turkey did not feel it was militarily capable of fighting. So he rebuffed attempts by the Germans to enter the war on the German side. As for the PKK, which is probably the more complicated question, the situation in Turkey, and we're going to discuss it when we talk about the creation of the republic, is a shift from Muslim nationalism, right? Muslim as an ethnic group, Muslim nationalism to Turkish nationalism, and the winnowing of all the ethnic groups into Turks. This becomes a huge part of the Republican Party policy, Republican meaning Kemalist party in Turkey. The Republican Party policy, that there were no distinctions between the various Muslims. In fact, they were all truly Turks. And to the extent that they believed themselves to be Circassians, Laws, Kurds, or any other, this was because they were misinformed through actions of history, not because they were actually distinct ethnic groups. And we talked about the Sun language theory, holding that everybody's original language was Turkish. And so the fact that they spoke different languages was simply that they had lost their traditional tongues. They had been altered and bastardized. And so because of that, they should truly be Turks. They should truly convert to being Turks. Now, the Kurds resisted this, and they resisted it primarily from religious leadership. The Kurds tended to organize behind their religious leaders. And so you had Kurdish revolts that were put down quite aggressively by the Kemalist government. Probably the worst was the massacre of Dersim in 1937. And following that, the Turkish religious community basically lost the war against the Republican Party, which remained in power until İnönü surrendered to the first free and fair elections in the 50s. Now, I have a comment. İnönü actually had meetings with Churchill in secret, trying to persuade him to join the Allies, and it didn't work for exactly the same reason. But with the failure of the religious community in the Kurdish world, the Kurds flipped and began to support a socialist group promoted by the Russians. The Russians, at this point, under the Soviet Union, this is the end of Stalin's period, beginning of Khrushchev's period. The Soviets were seeing NATO's extension through Turkey as being a strategic issue, and any way to destabilize the Turkish Republic would be a benefit to the Soviet Union. And so you have Soviet funding. On one side, you have the shift away from religious authorities in the Kurdish world because of their failure against the Republican Party to secular authorities in the Kurdish world. This coalesced with the creation of a strongly socialist to the point of being communist. There's a debate about whether they're technically communist or not, but the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, came to the fore in the 70s and 80s as the major representative of Kurdish militancy against Turkish authority, resulting in a war that was at its most acute in 1978. And the conflict between Turks and Kurds since the inception of the Republic of Turkey has resulted in more than 2 million Kurds fleeing their home, 40,000 deaths, primarily of Kurdish civilians, some Turkish soldiers as well, and the repression of the Kurdish language and identity. But the PKK basically continued to be the largest Turkish militant group defending Kurdish rights or fighting for Kurdish rights, regardless of whether any Kurds in the territory particularly supported them or not. And the PKK serves as an effective boogeyman in many respects for the Turkish government to disqualify other non-violent Kurdish political groups through their association to the PKK or claimed association to the PKK. One of these in particular, one issue in particular that caused consternation between Turkey and the Western allies with regard to the Syrian civil war was that the Western countries were supporting the YPG, which is an offshoot of the PKK, different leadership at this point, but same ideology, and they see themselves as sister organizations. The YPG, because it is a sister of the PKK, was viewed very negatively by Turkey, and because it was a secular oriented organization arguing for the equality and freedom of all subject populations in Syria, it was viewed very positively by the West. So that led to Western military support for the YPG, funding and arms, while the Turks used their FSA, which was their military proxy, the Free Syrian Army, to attack the YPG. There's a question: if Turkey was neutral in the war, can you speak about the Struma disaster? I'm actually light on the details of the Struma disaster. I'm not familiar with that. I know that, generally speaking, Turkey did everything possible to avoid any confrontation. So anything that looked like it could be transportation of arms, of weapons, they generally tried to avoid that. So I don't know the specifics of the Struma disaster, so I can't really speak about it. Sorry. Any other questions? We can talk about modern politics. We can talk about the European Union stuff that I do with Aaron. We can talk about religions in the Middle East. Anything that you guys have questions about. This is sort of an open forum for anybody who wants to basically find out more about this region of the world. There's a question: does Erdogan have his own definition of what Ottoman means? I think I absolutely think he does. Erdogan has been classified by many as a neo-Ottomanist because his policy is to recreate the Ottoman Empire through diplomacy, not through war. And so his goal has been to increase diplomatic relations with the countries of the former Ottoman Empire in order to exert Turkish political hegemony over them. In some cases, it works. Bosnia and Albania are particularly susceptible to this, and they see it as a positive that the Turkish government can flush their countries with money and build all kinds of roads, bridges, infrastructure that they desperately need. So it's not necessarily badly seen by the secondary parties in this relationship. Of course, though, you can imagine Bulgaria, Greece, and Serbia have a little bit more trepidation as concerns Turkish involvement in their future. But I think the fundamental belief of the AKP, which is the Freedom and Justice Party that Erdogan leads, their orientation is an Islamist orientation. And it's an orientation that the failure of modern Turkey has been its secularism and its failure to embrace the religious identity of the Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim first identity, but an acceptance of non-Muslims and this sort of wider presence of Islam in the Turkish cultural space. And so that's sort of what he's trying to implement. I don't think that he really foresees the Sharia becoming I really don't think that he sees that as being the long-term goal of the country to sort of revert to sort of the Ottoman style of government, right, with a sultan and the Sheikh al-Islam and janissaries. And that's just not viable in the modern world. But I think he wants to create more of that religious in public space. And that's sort of his understanding of Ottoman on a domestic scale. And we sort of see that with him doing certain political moves that only make sense in light of Sharia. For example, he argued that the massive inflation that Turkey was experiencing should not be abated by raising interest rates, which is what countries typically do to avoid inflation, because raising interest rates is a violation of riba, which is the prohibition on usury in Islam. So there are these sort of things, but by and large, he doesn't seem to be making any moves towards the actual repeal of Sharia. It's more of these sort of customary laws that he wants to sort of implement. There's a question about violation of airspace between Greece and Turkey. Who's doing the violations and why? If I go back, you can see that the Turkish territory really ends at the end of the physical land of Anatolia. Most of the islands in the Aegean Sea are Greek sovereign territory. And so one of the difficulties that Greece and Turkey have is monitoring the airspace where the Greek islands end and where the Turkish mainland begins. And in some cases, we're talking about 2 or 3 kilometers separating the islands from the coast. So it's not very far. But the Turkish government, at least from Greek accusations, will repeatedly send fighter jets over that boundary and fly them over the Greek islands that are very close to Anatolia in violation of Greek airspace, because those are military fighters and they do not have consent from Greece to fly over Greek territory. Greece has escalated this problem on numerous occasions to NATO. NATO has reprimanded Turkey, but since NATO has no disciplinary chapters, Turkey sort of just gets yelled at, and then Turkey just keeps on doing it. From the Turkish perspective, they also have problems with Greece, and their problem with Greece is that often people who are persona non grata by the Turkish government are people that are often flown from Turkey to Greece, and they live in exile in Greece. And so Greece has supported a number of Turkish governments in exile during the Republic period. And so Turkey is very angry about the way that Greece uses its airspace to protect Turkish people who would otherwise either be in jail or be substantially curtailed in their political efforts. So there's negativity on both sides of that. There's a question about the Cyprus invasion and the non-recognition of Turkish Cyprus. Sure. So this goes back to how in 1878, as a thank you from the Ottoman Empire to the British for helping negotiate the treaty, the Congress of Berlin in 1878, which severely curtailed Russian gains that they had made in the War of 1877 to 1878, the British got control of Cyprus, and it was a lease to the Turkish government. In 1914, when World War I began, the British directly seized the island and began running it. Because the British controlled the island after World War I, it was not part of the population exchanges between Greece and Turkey in 1923, meaning that the island had a mixed population as it became independent in 1960. It became independent from the British. At that point, the island was about 20% Turkish and 80% Greek. And when I say Turkish and Greek in this case, I'm referring to the religious orientation of Muslim versus Greek Orthodox. There were other minorities on the island as well, but they don't sum up to more than 4%. The Constitution of Cyprus, that when Cyprus became independent in 1960, was organized in such a way that it would strike a balance between the Greek majority and the Turkish minority, and Greece, Turkey, and Britain were all given the power to intervene if one of the groups appeared to be making it difficult for the other ones. Starting in the 1970s, the Greek government, which had been overtaken by a military junta, tried to declare a gnosis or forcible union with Cyprus, And so the Turkish minority felt like they would come under siege. They petitioned Turkey to intervene on their behalf to prevent Cyprus from becoming part of Greece. And so in 1974, the Turks led an amphibious invasion of northern Cyprus. After 3 days, there was a ceasefire called. We'll definitely touch on all of this in much more detail when we get to the modern history of Cyprus. But after 3 days, a ceasefire was called, and the ceasefire line has effectively been the division between the Turkish-occupied north and the now Greek exclusively south, because Turkish citizens in the south fled to the Turkish-occupied region, and Greeks in the north, with the exception of those in Rizikar, which is at the northernmost end of the island, south of where when the Turks made landfall, they made landfall south of Rizikar. So the Greeks to the north didn't flee, and so there's a certain ceasefire protection for them. But basically, the island is split in, with the northern third being under Turkish occupation and the southern 2/3 being independent Cyprus. Turkey recognizes that the government in the northern half of the city of Nicosia, which they occupy the northern half of the city, that government rules Cyprus, but that government is seen by most foreign entities as being part of the Turkish government. It has loyalty only to Turkey. It implements the policy of Turkey, and additionally, 200,000 Anatolian citizens moved to northern Cyprus. And when you consider the island has a population of just over 1 million people, 200,000 really changes the population demographics. And of course, the northern population completely accepted this. And so the allision between Turkey and this government in northern Cyprus seems fake, because of the interconnectivity between the Turkish government in Ankara and the government in the northern half of Nicosia, which is why the north is not recognized by any entity. The south is recognized as Cyprus by pretty much every country on earth, and Cypriot passports are valid, and Cyprus is part of the European Union. In fact, Cyprus, the government of Cyprus on the south side of Nicosia, recognizes all of the inhabitants of the north, except those who have descendants from those Anatolians who moved to the island, as being part of the Cypriot population and are eligible for Cypriot passports, despite living under foreign occupation. Now, there's a question as to why was Turkey concerned? Just to finish Cyprus, there were attempts to reunify the island. The closest came in 2004, but the Turks refused to remove those 200,000 settlers, and because of that, the Republic of Cyprus refused to accept the unification, and they will only accept unification if the settlers are sent back to Turkey. They will accept Turkish Cypriots as part of their country, but not Turkish Turks. There's a question, why was Turkey concerned about the admission of Sweden and Finland to NATO? Turkey wasn't concerned at all. This was a power play. Turkey has wanted a number of Western missiles, Western aircraft, and Turkey had been cut off from these because of its purchase of the Russian S-400 missiles, right? NATO members are not supposed to buy military equipment from the enemies of NATO, especially if they come with their own tactical teams. And so Russians can learn how to aim their S-400 missiles at modern American aircraft. So the Americans cut off deals to provide them weapons, and so Turkey used its veto vote, because any member of NATO can veto the admission of any new member of NATO. So Turkey used its effective veto to compel the Americans to give them weapons that they had been previously denying them, in exchange for Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Turkey had no reservations, expressed no reservations prior to Sweden and Finland joining. It was when they were in the admissions process that they suddenly said no. And as soon as they got what they were looking for in terms of that side deal, they completely flipped, which is why the no period was like 2 days or 3 days. It literally was, it was a negotiation tactic, and it worked. Turkey had the West over a barrel. There's a question of, can you talk about the 10 lost tribes of Israel? Certainly. The 10 lost tribes of Israel are okay. So if we go back in the chronology of the Levant region, the earliest tested sources extrinsic to the Bible hold that there were two what we would anachronistically call Jewish kingdoms. One was in the north; it was called Israel, and was the more powerful of the two kingdoms. It possessed a maritime coast and a small navy. And in the south, there was a secondary group that ruled a country called Judah. In 722 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, based in what is now northern Iraq, invaded the northern kingdom, and as part of the Assyrian policy of conquest, they deported the indigenous population to other areas within the Assyrian Empire. It's unknown what became of those 10 tribes, other than that they assimilated, generally speaking, with the larger Assyrian population. Now, there are groups who say that one of the tribes or two of the tribes have fled to Africa or Asia or somewhere else, and there are numerous groups of people who claim descendants from these 10 lost tribes. By and large, they have nothing but their own claims to substantiate that. It's rare that we would see anything that would indicate that they have primarily Levantine heritage. Okay. Thank you, Zach, for the information on the stroma. I can't really say more than what you put there. I have a question of what do I think of BDS? I think that BDS, I mean, this sort of shows my hand. I think the BDS targets the wrong side of the Israel-Palestinian issue, in that it targets exactly the people who are the best facilitators of peace. I don't see why it makes sense to ban academics. I don't see why it makes sense to ban business people when the issue, if to the extent that Israel's maintaining an occupation in the West Bank and blockading the Gaza Strip, and this is worsening the lives of Palestinians, academics and business people are not the ones doing the harm. It's just that's not the case. If you want to have something like we refuse to allow anybody who served at higher than a sergeant in the Israeli military on university campuses, or you had something along the lines of, protesting arms shipments to Israel. I understand that. I tend to be more pro-Israeli than I am pro-Palestinian. So I don't personally agree that that's the right way to go about it. But that at least seems in keeping with the idea of promoting Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation. Because you'd be trying to shut down the military apparatus and promoting the civilian apparatus, because it's going to be the civilian apparatus that solves this. The military is not going to solve this in any peaceable way, with the possible exception of genocide, right? That's the only way the military can solve this problem. The way that civilians can solve this problem is through negotiation. So I just think that BDS it's not targeted at the right entities, and it's targeted at exactly the wrong entities. If you want a solution, you need Israeli academics to talk to non-Israeli academics. That's literally the only way that they're going to change their mind. There's a question about the Gulenist movement, and to the extent that they challenge Wahhabism. The Gulenist movement is within the spectrum of Islamism. Gulenism is probably the least offensive kind of Islamism in terms of strength of belief and violence in orientation, meaning that they're for those of you who are familiar with Joel Osteen, Gulenism is, for all intents and purposes, the Joel Osteenism of the Islamist movement, meaning that it's rather watered down from the more literalist doctrines, and it's significantly less violent, more open to personal interpretation, more open to spiritual study than it is to dogmatic stricture. And there's a benefit to that, and there's a cost to that. The benefit to that is that it's a lot easier for people to ascribe to the movement, a lot less personal cost. The problem with that is that it can also create connections within governments. And so what Erdogan was afraid of with regards to the Gülenists is that the Gülenists counted within their number individuals who were high up in the Turkish government, and therefore if Fethullah Gülen, who was the leader of the movement, really wanted to, he could pull some strings in Turkish politics beyond what a typical lobbying group might be able to do. That's what the fear was. I don't see it as being terribly rational. I also don't see it as really competing with Wahhabism, besides it just being in the Islamist space and advocating something else. Wahhabism is generally financed by Saudi Arabia, to the extent that it is externally promulgated. And that financing goes to the construction of mosques. It goes to the teaching of imams who will go to other countries. There's a lot of different things that are involved in that enterprise, and I don't really see a fight between Gülenists and Wahhabists. Maybe I'm missing something, but they sort of operate in different spaces. All right. Any further questions, curiosities? Thank you for the kind words. Okay. One of the things that sort of we haven't covered this time around, and it's something that I intend to cover when we get to Persia, is the transition of medieval Persia to modern Persia. And I think one of the really interesting things there is that while Kemalism works for Turkey in terms of creating this sort of secular Turkish Republic, it spectacularly backfired with Iran. And I think that one of the main reasons, and we're going to discuss this, is that during the reign of Reza Khan and his successor Mohammad Reza Pahlavi Shah, the mosque remained the center of opposition to the regime. Remember, in the Turkish case, the Kurdish religious leaders were put down. In Iran, because religion became a source of refuge, that actually became the place where the largest agglomeration of revolutionaries met, and many of them were secular in orientation, but many others were Islamist in orientation, and the Islamists won the day diplomatically. There's a question about where is Erdogan taking Turkey. I honestly don't know beyond what we've said earlier. I think he has an Ottomanist direction. I think he wants to expand Turkey's foreign influence. I think he wants to sort of play the West against Russia for the better deal. I think sort of taking from the example of Thailand during the colonial period, right, which played the British against the French. I think he's trying to play the West against Russia to continually get a better deal. And with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think he's finally settled on the fact that playing with Russia is probably not in his best interest. I think from a domestic point of view, I think he wants to increase the acceptability of Islam in the public space. In many ways, from a domestic perspective, you can think of it as if a leading evangelical took control of the U.S. government. If Pence took control of the U.S. government, I think would be a good sort of segue, sort of making manifestations of religion more and more publicly acceptable. And one of the things, as you mentioned, is turning Hagia Sophia into a fully functioning mosque. That was one of the symbols that Ataturk did in order to show that his regime was secular, is that he removed the mosque function from the Hagia Sophia. It had been converted to a mosque by Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror. But by turning it into a museum, he was able to expose the Greek architecture and also recognize it as a contribution to Turkish civilization by the historic Greeks who lived there. By turning it into a fully functioning mosque, it's a subtle way for Erdogan to show that he's trying to increase the presence of Islam in the public space. And he's also restoring one of the chief mosques of Istanbul, which, and he's restored mosques throughout Turkey as a show of his increasing presence of religion on the public stage. A number of mosques that he's opened have been formerly Assyrian, Greek, or Armenian centers of worship that survived. And in 1923, we talked about the Treaty of Lausanne. One of the protections of the Treaty of Lausanne was that worship centers for Armenians, Greeks, and Jews would be protected from Turkish change, but Assyrian centers of worship were never so protected, and so Assyrian centers of worship tend to be mosquified more often than those of other religions. But in terms of the show, right, in terms of how it affects people's minds, it really sets the stage for increasing religion in public life, and that's really what he's going for here. Yeah, I think that sort of explains it. There's a question here. The West Bank was supposed to be part of Israel. During the War of Independence, Jordan captured the West Bank and part of Jerusalem and expelled the Jews. The people in the West Bank were Jordanians, but the king canceled their Jordanian citizenship. Jordan was created to separate Jews and Muslims. Originally, Jordan was supposed to be part of Israel. There are several different pieces here. The mandate for Palestine, as described in the San Remo Conference of 1920, which was the first legal instantiation of the mandate, held that the territories that now comprise the states of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan would all be part of what is the mandate of Palestine, with the eastern part being separable, eastern being east of the Jordan River, Transjordan, being separable if it was in the opinion of the mandatory authority, that being the British, that it would be better for the preservation of peace and stability in the region. In 1922, the British acted upon that part of the San Remo Conference definition of the mandate and created Transjordan as a separate mandatory authority. They did so primarily to reward the Hashemite dynasty of Saudi Arabia, which had been forced out of power because of the Hijazi Nejdi wars in Saudi Arabia. We'll cover those soon. And that resulted in creating Transjordan, with Emir Abdullah becoming the new king of that territory. And after that point, Transjordan was cut off from further Jewish settlement. Whether that's acceptable under the terms of the mandatory policy is debated. Generally, it's accepted by international scholars that the British action, while not traditionally acceptable within the reason to create Transjordan, once Transjordan was created, the failure to permit Jews to settle there was acceptable. You then begin to have Jewish settlement throughout the Mandate of Palestine accelerating throughout the 1920s relative to what it had been under Ottoman rule. That's not to say that there weren't aliyot or Jewish migrations to Ottoman Palestine, and I'm using the Palestinian the borders of Mandatory Palestine retroactively. Those were not the borders during the Ottoman period, but there were migrations of Jews to this region during the Ottoman period, but they strongly accelerated during the 1920s, such that by 1947, Jews had risen from being roughly 5% of the overall mandatory population to roughly 1/3 of the mandatory population. I think it was from about 8,000 people to about 600,000 people. So quite a large rise in population. And when the Jews moved to mandatory Palestine, they moved generally to coastal cities where they could practice commerce. Many of the Chalutzim, or pioneering Jews, believed themselves to be agriculturalists. They soon discovered that they were less capable than they thought, having grown up mostly in cities, and ended up generally hiring Arabs to work the land with them. They created a number of institutions throughout the mandatory period in order to protect themselves from increasingly violent, I'm going to call them anachronistically Palestinian Arabs. They wouldn't have called themselves that at that time. They would have called themselves just Arabs, but from Palestinian Arabs. And the Palestinian Arabs began to develop later than the Jews a number of militant organizations, because they had been harassing the Jews as individuals or as tribal units. They hadn't been doing it from a national perspective. By 1947, the British were no longer interested in administering the territory, and they gave the question up to the League of Nations as to how to divide the mandate. The mandate was divided into what was supposed to be a Jewish state, divided in 3 pieces through connective tissue, an Arab state also divided into 3 pieces with some connective tissue, and what's called a corpus separatum, or a separated international corridor for Jerusalem. Now, all of the territory of the West Bank, with some very minor exclusions, would have been part of the Arab state under the UN proposal, which is UN General Assembly Resolution 181. Unless the proposal was that the West Bank was supposed to be part of Israel because it was part of the mandate for Palestine in 1922 or 1919, in 1922 or 1920, then it was never supposed to be part of the Jewish state. And there's huge debate as to whether the Jewish national home envisioned by the San Remo Conference indicates that there should be a Jewish state. In fact, it specifically passed with that wording because of debates in the British government over that exact issue. The Zionist Jews accepted the UN resolution. The Arabs on the ground did not. The war that ensued resulted in Israel's favor, and Israel controlled most of the territory that had been allotted to it, almost all of it, that had been allotted to it under the 1947 partition plan, and some territory that had been allotted to the Arab state under the partition plan. The Arab state did not come to fruition until the 1980s and 1990s with the peace agreements, especially the agreement in 1993 between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, establishing the Palestinian Authority over the territory. So it's a little bit more complicated than I think was laid out here. There is a point here that the Jordanians expelled the Jews in the territory that they conquered. The Jordanians were involved in that war against the nascent Jewish state, and there were several kibbutzim and the population of the old city of Jerusalem that included Jews that were expelled by the Jordanian militants, and the Jordanians refused to allow any Jews to return to their homes after the war. In similar behavior, Israel prevented most of the Palestinians that had been expelled during the wars, either fleeing from Israeli soldiers or under orders from Israeli troops, to return to their historic towns and cities. So we have this from both sides. When Israel reconquered conquered, let's say, the West Bank from Jordan in 1967. They put the area under military authority, and there was a return of Jews to the region, some who were the descendants of those who had been expelled, others who were coming to create new settlements. There's a question: did the Soviet Union and the USA vote in the UN in favor in Israel? Yes, they did. The two of them voted for Israel for very different reasons. The US actually was rather late to the party on this. The Soviet Union was more pro-Israel at this point than Israel was. Gromsky, who was the Soviet representative to the United Nations, he doesn't really write much about this period, but his motives have generally been understood by historians to be the following. The first is that the predominant community of Jewish Zionists in Israel tended to organize into what are called kibbutzim or moshavim. Kibbutzim are socialist communes, and moshavim are slightly less socialist communes. And because of this orientation towards socialism, towards the Workers' Party, they had already, the Zionists had already established what was called the Histadrut, which was a large labor union, and a number of other entities. The Soviet Union felt that Israel would become a communist state in the Middle East and therefore would be a natural ally. And that's why the Soviet Union supported it, generally speaking. As I said, Gromsky has not written clearly about the period, so we don't know. And he was the Soviet representative. The Americans, there was a lot of animosity between President Dwight Eisenhower, between President Harry Truman and Secretary Dulles of the State Department on the question of the Jewish state. Secretary Dulles generally took the British position, which was that supporting the Jews in the historic territory of Palestine would not be advantageous to their hard-won alliances with the Arabs, which were necessary for oil procurement. And so Dulles was strongly against supporting Israel at the UN vote. And the reason that Truman was remarked to be a relatively pious Christian, but his Christian faith was not inclined to see a return of Israel, right? There are different kinds of Christians. And his wife was reportedly anti-Semitic as well. She wouldn't allow Jews in the house, it said. But Truman was entranced by Chaim Weizmann, who was one of the leading Zionist advocates, and the two of them had numerous meetings. Weizmann was able to convince Truman to support Israel at the United Nations, and that's why the two of them voted in favor of Israel for wildly different reasons. In 1953, as Israel clearly became more and more aligned with Britain and France, the United States would not become a major player in the Middle East until 1956. As Israel became aligned with Britain and France, basically the Soviet Union lost interest and started supporting the Arab countries and creating what's been seen as the Soviet Arab axis against Israel and the West. There's a comment: Muslims created fear among Palestinians, that's why they fled. All the Muslims that stayed in Israel became Israeli citizens. There is certainly a degree to which Muslim leaders went on the radio and announced that when they had defeated the Jews, that this is in the 1947 to 1949 conflict, that when they had defeated the Jews, they would return the Muslims to where they had lived previously. They should just flee to get out of the way of the Jewish barbarians. There were also instances where Israeli soldiers, if we use that term anachronistically, went to Palestinian homes and threatened them with violence. There were cases, minority cases like Deir Yassin, where Israeli forces did use violence against Palestinian civilians. And so the combination of fear of what the Israelis could do based on examples of what they did do, and the promises made to them by their own leaders, led to a large percentage of them fleeing. Now, there are areas, of course, where Muslims did not flee, and the Muslims who did not flee, they can be divided generally into two different categories. The first are those who were in pivotal positions during the war, I'm going to call it the War of Independence because that's the Israeli perspective. During the War of Independence, there were those Muslims, for example, the Muslims of Abu Ghosh. Abu Ghosh is a town along the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem highway, which was a key corridor to defend during the Independence War. And the Arabs of Abu Ghosh basically allowed the Israelis to use their mountain position to survey the road. And the Sheikh Abu Ghosh entrusted his 5 daughters to Israeli commanders as a proof of his loyalty to the Israeli cause. The Arabs of Abu Ghosh never fought themselves in the war, but kept outside of it. So that's the smaller group of Arabs. Sorry, there are 3 groups, not 2. They're the Arabs of Abu Ghosh. There are the Arabs of the north. Those are the ones primarily in the Jezreel Valley. That's the area between Haifa and Tiberias in the northern part of Israel. And that area is still over 75% Arab. And the thing is that the Israeli troops advanced so quickly because the Lebanese and Syrian armies defending the north collapsed, as did Khulukji's militant forces. That those Arab areas came under Israeli control within a couple of days, and the Israeli forces offered them the terms of surrender, and seeing no way out, they agreed. The third group of Arabs, of course, are those Arabs that actually fought alongside the IDF. We're talking about Druze, we're talking about Bedouins, we're talking about some small Arab tribes, but by and large, the settled Arabs who lived in towns and cities, did not fight with the Israelis. They fought against the Israelis, or they fled, or except for the first 2 cases that I gave you. One of the leading Israeli commanders during the Independence War was Amos Yarkoni. That was his code name during the war. He was actually a Bedouin who achieved the rank, I believe, of colonel, if not general, in the Israeli army during the Independence War, and was celebrated for his contribution to the state of Israel. There's a point that a lot of the Latin American, and yes, all the Muslims who stayed in Israel did become Israeli citizens. However, it's worth noting that between 1949 and 1966, Arab majority cities like Al-Fahm, like Nazareth, like Afula, these cities were under militant Israeli occupation and subject to a different set of laws than the civilian areas of Israel. In 1966, this was changed, and those areas were subject to civilian rule. And coincidentally, in 1967, 1 year later, the areas of the West Bank would be subject to a similar kind of military rule that was used on the civilians. There's a comment that if not for the Latin Americans, Israel would not have been created. Yes, that's correct. The UN General Assembly Resolution 1812 required a 2/3 vote for a variety of internal reasons in the United Nations. It was not a pure majority vote, and a 2/3 vote. And the Latin American countries were the ones that tipped it over the 2/3 mark. So yes, without the Latin American countries, there would be no Israel. From the perception of most Latin American countries, the Middle East was a far off issue. And to the extent that there were Middle Eastern populations in Latin America, those would certainly grow after 1947. In fact, it's said that there are more Lebanese in Brazil than there are in Lebanon. But at this point, they were not large enough or politically ascendant enough to have influence in Latin American politics. So Latin American countries generally voted in favor of the partition plan as a result of their reaction to the Holocaust. And they, at least in the moment, they understood that Jews needed a place where they could be safe from violence. There's a point that Carlos Menem was descended from the Arab population. That is true. A lot of the Arab populations in Latin America are disproportionately represented now in business and in government. They weren't in the 1940s. All right. anything else? All right, since we are at the witching hour anyway, I think there's a point that Muslims in Abu Ghosh blocked the road to Jerusalem. Yes, they did. They blocked the road to Jerusalem. Then the Sheikh came to a peace with the IDF. I believe it was the IDF at that point. It may have been the Haganah. Depends on exactly when it happened. But they came to peace with the Israeli forces, and that was part of the peace, was the surrender to permit Israelis to use Abu Ghosh as a post, and that the Sheikh of Abu Ghosh would surrender his 5 daughters. So they did that because they didn't want to be removed, and so they were willing to accept neutrality after that point. There's the point that Jews were starving in Jerusalem during the Independence War. That's absolutely correct. That was the point. The Arabs were besieging the city. The goal was to drive the Jews out of the old city. The Jordanians were successful in this. There was a lot of harsh fighting in Jerusalem, and the main objective of the Israeli forces at the time was to secure the road from Tel Aviv, where resources were, to Jerusalem, where the population was. And of course, for both religious and governmental reasons, Israel wanted to maintain control of at least West Jerusalem, if not the whole of the city. When Jerusalem came completely under Israeli control in 1967, moves were made by the Israeli government to reunify the city from a political perspective. There's a point that Muslims destroyed all the synagogues of Jerusalem. That's not true. Muslims destroyed a number of the synagogues in Jerusalem. Some of them survived. Probably the bigger issue is that Muslims, the Jordanians, when they controlled the city, defaced and otherwise abused the Western Wall, which was a holy site to Jews and still remains so. Yeah. All right. I think this is the point where we can close it out. And I'll see everybody next week for the Caucasian Wars. Zach, if you want to talk about some this Saturday, there is unfortunately Vuk is unable to make it, but we will continue his Yugoslavia series, which is just about to start. I'll fill in for him. Hopefully I can do half good job as he would have done. And then on Sunday, at both these are 2 p.m. Eastern time, Saturday and Sunday. On Sunday, it's going to be me and Aaron De Los Reyes talking about the European Union defense. On Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern time, there's going to be the Caucasian Wars, which are what happened between 1917 and 1921 in the Caucasus region. It was an incredibly turbulent time for Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Then on the 4th of September, we're going to have the final entry into the Islam 101 series with Dr. Sabila Ahmed, and I'll be posing several questions to him that are a little bit more in depth than what he covered in his original presentations. But of course, there are numerous other programs that we're putting on, like our Powerful Women series, our philosophy series. I encourage you to look at the YouTube channel, to look at our meetup group. Our links are in the bottom. There is a link to the Islam 101 episodes. If you go to the History, Fitness, and Investing, there should be a playlist for the Islam 101 episodes, and you can see all of those. You can also see the link to the latest one. It's the 3rd comment from the top.
Thank you, Richard. This was really good. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And I'll see everybody soon. Zach, do you want to add anything?
No, I just want to thank you and It was a really, really good Q&A session, and people had to like kind of free floating questions. I appreciate for answers on Gulanism and all other Ataturk. I mean, this is something that you can't, unless you want to, you can Google it, but it does give me pleasure. And a lot of people, I'm sure, the same way to to kind of ask, Encyclopedia Richard about this stuff.
Thank you. No, the thing is that you can get Wikipedia. Wikipedia is really great for factual information. Wikipedia is not really great in terms of weaving the story together. And that's I hope I was able to do that, sort of lead you through the trajectory of some of these different issues.
Yeah, you remind me back in Soviet Union, we had obviously a lot of Ashkenazi Jews living in like Kiev, and there was no Wikipedia or encyclopedia. It was this Britannica. But if you wanted to ask a real question, you go to this one of the Ashkenazi Jews. I'm a Sephardic Jew, and you would get all the answers that even Western world, Eastern world, they're very well read. Like Greg, for example, So it was always interesting. So you remind me of somebody like I can go to you and get all the questions answered. So appreciate it.
My pleasure. All right. So I'll see everybody on Saturday, Sunday, or Thursday, hopefully. And look forward to it. All right.